Music theory with OneNote. Auto-transposable music system through all 12 collections of 7 notes, each collection being automatically rotatable to all 7 modal perspectives, changing the tonic upon rotation. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS, Presentation 2509, OneNote Auto-Transposable System through 12 collections of notes, 7 modes each, list of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend all our time on the music theory side of things, but we also have somewhere a similarly named and numbered set of presentations where we actually build these out in Excel, practicing not only our music theory skills, but our Excel and table visualization skills as well. Let's give a quick overview of our objective. We want to be thinking about a musical system that allows us to jot down our musical ideas, our melodies, our tunes, our chords, our songs as efficiently as possible, noting that the current options we have out there is to write something in like a sheet music format or possibly a tablature format, or to go over to a DAW type system of format. But none of those are as efficient as they could be. So even if you're writing by hand, want to give some ideas on how you might do that more efficiently. And in the future, I believe that the DAW systems and the MIDI data input systems will take on some of these more efficiencies, allowing us a much larger range of tinkering with our musical ideas in a way that's musically efficient. So generally, if we have our sheet music, you might write it down something like this. We'll come back to this in a second, or compare that to a DAW type situation where we're basically stacking chords like this. So we have everything stacked on top of each other. This is also similar to what you would see in a sheet music type of situation where you have the staff and we're basically stacking chords on top of each other. Now note that if you have an orchestra, then that sheet music situation kind of would make more sense, because you might be building chords with multiple instruments, stacking chords on top of each other. But oftentimes, we're stacking our own musical ideas, adding music together in the modern system using software oftentimes. So it would be nice if we had the capacity to write actual chords instead of stacking. It'll be a lot less cluttered if we were able to do that. So we also have tablature type of music, which basically is a way for us to give us a shorthand when we're writing down songs, but the tablature also doesn't give us as much, it's not as give us as much information as, say, the sheet music would. And then of course we have a DAW system, which is going to have this stacked kind of system. What I'd like to be able to see is say, hey, whether I do it in a DAW system or I'm writing it down by hand, first I'd like to compress everything down so that I can have one row representing, say, one octave of information. That way I can write something that looks like this, which is a lot more similar to a tablature situation you might see than you might see in sheet music or a DAW. It's going to be a lot easier to follow, particularly if your song mainly consists of chords that are going to be in the same key. So that's the first thing I'd like to be able to do. I think a DAW system should be able to do that as well, meaning we should be able to write the information in this format, and the DAW system should be able to then take those chords and expand them into this format, meaning that orange area, the row that we had in orange, is representing one octave, where in a DAW or like a sheet music format, that would be expanded to these columns here, and one chord would be shown as multiple notes stacked on top of each other. So this would be a lot more efficient to be able to see in one row. Now you might be saying, well, if I have one row, what are we going to label that to be? You know, you might call it middle C on the piano, for example. But really, I'd like to be able to say whatever I'm starting on, whatever collection of notes and the tonic that I'm on, I'd like that to be the lowest note. I think that would be the most efficient way to basically write our music. In other words, if I'm playing in the key collection of notes around the key of C and I'm playing a C major, then the C is going to be the lowest note. So I would like that to be the lowest note in this column, and then we're going to go up 12 available notes up from there that are represented in the same row, and that would be fine. If I then went to a D major, then I would like the lowest note here to be the D, and then all the other notes are going to be 12 notes up from that point. So this orange bit then will be dependent upon what collection of notes we're playing in. We can also represent the modes. So if I was playing in the collection of notes around the C major, but making the fifth the tonic, meaning I'm playing in G mixolydian, then I would like to make the lowest note the G and be counting up 12 from there, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of the mixolydian node. So that way we get all of the information in basically one row that can then be expanded out this way. So this would be in the key of C, and so note that we could also write it in this format. Now, even if you're writing by hand, I believe this format of writing would be more efficient. This is basically a Nashville number kind of system. People kind of think that a Nashville number system is less sophisticated, but it's not if you add all the detail to the Nashville number system, meaning the Nashville number system is looking at a 7-note collection, typically from the perspective of the Ionian node, but you can make any of the points in that system the modal center, and you can look at not only the 7 notes, but all 12 notes with a Nashville number type of system, giving permanent numbers to even those 5 notes outside the collection by giving them like a 0.5 within the numbering system. So if you were to write a song this way, then it would be automatically transposable, meaning if you wrote a melody with a Nashville number system, which was a permanent Nashville number system, then you can play it and say, I want to play that melody in in C major or in D major or in E major, and you don't have to rewrite the melody. You just write it in relative terms, and then the collection of notes is automatically shiftable and transferable to all 12 collections of 7 notes. That would be much more efficient. Chords too can be written that way, meaning if I say it's a triad chord, the triad major chord could be, you could just name the node that you're on. It's a 3-note Ionian chord, or it's a 3-note Dorian chord, or it's a 3-note whatever, 6-note Lydian chord. That will give you the information without tying you into a note, but it'll tell you the chord by node, making it once again automatically transferable. So this way of writing is actually more efficient because again it allows you to transpose everything automatically while still giving you all 12 notes, all the flexibility, and giving you the ability to put chords into one column instead of having the stacking situation. This then in a DAW should be transferable to this, meaning the DAW system should be able to see this and then make the chords from it. Or you should be able to write the chords and the DAW system can then put it into the generic relative position. Why would the DAW want to do that? Because in a DAW system, that's what allows you to automatically transpose it. So if I wrote the song in C major, the DAW would, and I did it in this format, the DAW could convert it to this format, and then it could basically transpose it to all 12 collections. Same with any other mode. If I wrote it in Dorian, then it can basically pick all of the Dorian components as well. So that would be a much more efficient system. Now note that to do that, you actually have to say to the system like what the perspective of the song is. There's 2 dials that we're working with. One is going to be the collection of notes that we're going to be working on, and the other is the modal point or the tonic. So in other words, I have to tell the system I'm in the collection of notes around the C major or whatever the collection of notes is, and I have to give it the tonic, meaning which of the modal pointed perspectives am I looking at. And then from that, those two dials can then be turned automatically, meaning I can then shift everything up through the 12 collections of notes. Or I can rotate the dial for the modal perspective, changing it from the Ionian perspective, for example, and changing it up a note, a nod, everything shifting to the Dorian perspective, the Phrygian perspective, and so on and so forth. So that would be a useful thing to do. Now remember, now also note that you might say, well, look, the whole song might not be in one collection of notes, or it might be in one collection of notes, but using different modal perspectives, meaning I'm visualizing the tonic changing as we play through the song. That should be okay, right? Because then I can then select part of the song, say from here to here, maybe I'm visualizing the Ionian to be the tonic. And maybe from here to here, I've changed the tonic in my mind. I'm now thinking of it as a Dorian as the tonic, but the same collection of notes. And maybe from here to here, maybe I'm thinking about a different collection of notes. I should be able to basically mark that out in my sheet music and say, look, this part of the song, I'm visualizing from this modal perspective. This part of the song, I'm visualizing from this modal perspective. Why would that be useful? Because then you can write a very complex song. You can shift the entire song through all 12 collections of notes, rotating each of them, or you can switch the entire song, rotating to all the relative modal positions, changing the dial, or you can rotate the part of the song that you want, the part that you wrote in Dorian. Maybe you want to shift that forward and see what it would look like if you shifted it up to Phrygian and snapped it into place there or in a different collection of notes. So the ways that you can then use like a Rubik's Cube to mix and match and tinker with your music is going to be a lot better in a format that's actually musically coherent. Whereas if you just have 12 collections of notes and you're moving the whole thing around in a DAW system like this, it's just too much information to move around a very long piece of work around in a systematic way that's going to be musical, right? If I assign everything a relative position, then I can do that, basically. So notice I can also rotate it. The other way we rotate it is modally, right? So if this is in the key of C, the collection of notes around the key of C, I could rotate it forward down here to the Dorian. So now I'm going to say it's in D, but now it's in D Dorian. So I've rotated, the chords have all been shifted up. Notice when I do this, the Dorian is a minor mode, the Ionian is a major mode. So it's not quite as simple as shifting up to all 12 collections of 7 notes, as we would if it was going from Ionian, C Ionian to D Ionian. This time we're going to the related modal point, to Dorian. But if I have a chord, notice I can just rename the chord. So this was an Ionian chord, now it's a 3-note Dorian chord. This was a 4-note Dorian, now it's a Phrygian. And all the chords will snap into place, meaning the Dorian now has a minor third as opposed to a major third, and all of the relative positions from a Nashville number system can then be rotated up to the relative positions. The only time you have a problem is if there's going to be one that was in the ocean, a note that's outside of the collection of 7 notes, and then it got transferred to a non-existent note. We'll talk about that more later. But the general idea is that you can shift it to the Phrygian, right? And then you could shift it up and rotate it to the Lydian. This is something that a DAW system should be able to do automatically, and it's something that we can do fairly easily if we were to write our music from the perspective of a Nashville number system. Because if I write it from the perspective of the Nashville number system, if it's in the Ionian, I could just shift everything forward and it'll into the Dorian, right? The Ionian, one shift forward would go to the Dorian. An Ionian chord, 2 shifts forward would make it a Phrygian chord. And then these numbers, I can do the same thing. It's only the ones that are in the ocean. If I shifted this one up 2.5 to 3.5, there is no 3.5 from a relative perspective So it would have to snap up to 4 in that case. All right. So that's the general idea. So we want to be able to write our information as efficiently as possible. And I truly believe that the DAW systems will at some point have this capacity, because it just makes sense that it would increase the ability for tinkering with music, particularly for those people that don't know music theory, as well as those that do, that want to make really complex things like jazz and whatnot, and want to tinker with it in a musical way. So I'm going to go over this fairly quickly. Again, we have a whole thing on this in Excel in another course or section if you want to break this out and try to build this in like a DAW or database. So notice we started, I just gave a background information for the MIDI system, just so you get an idea of how like the background information for like a DAW is basically broken out, meaning they use a numbering system that's not one that we would want to use to memorize music typically, because they started way at zero, which is an octave, a way low octave, so they can basically count up from that point. So they have a numbering system that we can use as an absolute numbering system, but it gets down to 60 being a C, right? From our perspective, to memorize numbers, I don't want to make the C, that would be C4, in the middle of a piano, the place that we play in most. I wouldn't want to make that number 60. I would want to make that number 1 or possibly number 0, right? But I just want to point out the numbering system in your database program is going to use this numbering system typically, because that's what's behind everything, right? But from our perspective, from a piano, you'd see that as C4. Now note that the C4 system also is something that I don't particularly, it's not the best system. Why did they choose 4 to be the C that we normally play in? You would think that they would have chose it from A, because that's the collection of notes. You would think that at least A would be A4, A to A. But of course the piano then is tuned to C, so we get this weird kind of thing happening there. And why did they choose 4? Because they didn't want to go into negative numbers. That way you can go into the low direction but not get negative. Why not have negatives? I don't know. They don't like negative numbers. What I would rather call it, right? If we were starting over, I would rather call this center point, the middle of the piano. I would name it from A to G sharp. The alphabet would be 0. That would be the 0 octave. And then you would go 2 octaves up to the right and 2 octaves back to the left. That would be nice, symmetrical, beautiful symmetry there. But we have to deal with what we're dealing with. Now notice again, as we put this into our tablature, we might want to start, like if I'm playing in this middle area, then if I'm starting whatever collection of notes I'm starting on, if it was on, the C that I was starting on, then we would be going from the C up from there. But if I was starting on a D, then I would like the D to be my lowest note. So again, if you're trying to make a nice, easy tablature that you're working in, if you're starting on D as the lowest note, it would be nice to have one row represented with D as the lowest notes, 12 notes up from there. Therefore, you can put 1 octave in one row by just defining what your starting point is, which is going to be somewhere in the middle section, either from C to C or from A to A, that would be your normal middle point where you typically play the middle of the piano. All right, so from our numbering system, I would like to number it 1 through 12, meaning our notes would have a numbering system of just 1 through 12. So A through G. I have A sharp and B flat represented by lowercase ab. So A, lowercase ab is A sharp or B flat. B, C, C sharp or D flat. D, D sharp or E flat. E, F, F sharp or G flat. G, and then G sharp or A flat back to A. So from a local distance, not taking into account octaves, I would number those 1 through 12. That numbering system is useful for our purposes, even as human beings, whereas to call the C60 is not as useful. And I would also like to make A to A, basically the middle part of the piano, but starting at A, what I would call octave 0. right? That would be octave 0, and then we go octave 1 would be going up to the right in pitch, and negative 1 would be going to the left in pitch. I think that would be the more efficient system if you can do it over or start from scratch. But we have to know whatever convention that we're working in to work in that convention. Then the numbering system that takes into account octaves, I would think would go up this way, right? 1 through 12, and then 13, 14, 15, 16, up to 36. So that means this would be the system if I was at 13 minus 12 is 1, the local distance. 14 minus 12 is 2, the local distance. So this would be the numbering system for an absolute numbering system that would be useful for human beings to memorize, whereas this numbering system is the one that's behind most of the DAW systems and MIDI systems. Okay, so then what about the chords? So then we can get our collection of notes, right? So our collection of notes, when we're playing in anything in Western musics, we're usually looking at it from the perspective of a 7-note collection. Now you might say, hey, look, what if I only want a 3-note collection because it's a chord? Or what if I want a 5-note collection because I'm playing in a pentatonic? Well, that's fine, but we typically think of the 5-note collection as a subset of the 7-note collection. So you can systematically look at this. We're basically looking at the system as 12 collections of 7 notes. That's useful to have because then I can look at the system from the perspective of the relative positions of all those 7 notes. That's what gives me the rotatable dial that should allow me to automatically turn the dial, allowing me to automatically transpose the system. At least that should be easy to do through all 12 collections of notes. So in other words, if I apply the whole half formula, if I start on C, and we can start anywhere, but if I start on C, it would be a whole step to D, and then a whole step to E, half step to F, whole step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, and then a half step back to C. So that from a local numbering system would be 4, 6, 8, 9, 11, 1, 3, or C, D, E, F, G, all the letters that are not sharp and flat. Here's the formula: whole, half, whole, half. Now that formula, if of course I start in any other location, like right here, that would be the formula for the Dorian, which would be whole, half, whole, half, whole, right? And then this would be the formula here. So it's all one formula. It's just that where you start at will differ, that will determine the mode that you're in. So this collection of notes then has 7 modes to it if you start on any of those collections of notes. Nashville number system gives a permanent number to those, which is basically taking the scale degrees for the major scale and making them permanent, not changing the 1, just keeping them the same. That is a key idea. That's important. That's more efficient to do, meaning if I have the scale degrees 1 through 7 for the major, I'm just going to keep those the same, and I could abbreviate it with the nodes, meaning Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian. This is Lydian, which I have with a Y, Mixolydian with an X, Aeolian, Locrian with an N. And then, so then if I play something in Dorian, I'm not going to change it to the 1. It's just going to be still 2 node, Nashville number 2, which is the Dorian node. That allows us again to have a dial that we can put up, allowing us to map out to turn the dial, right? So then in a chord situation, remember in sheet music, you often don't really have chords. You've got stacks of notes, kind of like a DAW system. So, and that's because classically you might have multiple people playing the song, building a chord up from different instruments and whatnot. But these days you might not have that, or even in a DAW you could still make the chord and assign different instruments to it or something like that. So it would be nice, as with tablature, to be able to represent chords. It's going to be a lot easier to see your sheet music if you can represent the basic chords. Now, when I say basic chords, what I mean is that you should at least be able to represent all chords from any modal perspective, any of the 7 notes in the system. And if you have a chord that has all the notes that are in the collection of 7 notes, those should be available to you, at least in its normal construction, meaning the tonic is the lowest, then the third, then the fifth, and so on and so forth, up in pitch from there. Those chords should be available. And then if you have more complex chords, meaning you have notes that are outside the collection of notes, the 5 notes outside the collection of notes, then that's when you would have to stack, right? You'd have to stack to have those, or you could have a more complex system that adds those more complex chords. And then how could you do that? Well, I'd like to be able to add the chords in such a way that I'm not referring to the notes. So if I'm in the collection of notes around the C major, I don't want to call it a C major chord, because if I call it a C major chord, I can't transpose it automatically, right? What I would have to do then is change it to a D major chord if I want to look at the collection of notes around the D. But if I name the chord by modal point, relative position, the entire thing as I write it is transposable. I just have to tell you which collection of notes I'm in. So in other words, a C major chord is just a 3-note triad built off of the Ionian node. You can write it this way, and the reason I started with an N is because if you're typing this into a system like a MIDI system, if you type a number 3, then that might just be a note number. But if you type an N, then you think you might get a drop down, or the system would know that you're going to try to draw a chord there, and then you'd have a chord. So it's a notes, there's 3 notes, it's an Ionian. You could also call it an Ionian 2 modal whole step chord. That's just the distance from the Ionian to the last note. You can also make it a capital, which if you're using an Ionian would tell you that that's the tonic. So in other words, you're saying I'm in this collection of notes around the C major, and this one is the tonic. I'm showing you that by showing it's a capital letter here. You could also name it by range, meaning the Ionian chord, if I have a 1, 3, 5, will be a range going from the 1 to the 5, meaning Nashville number 1 to Nashville number 5, the Ionian to the Mixolydian. So in a DAW system, any of these ways to name the chord should be available. I can toggle through, I should be able to say, hey, look, show me the chord in any of these ways that I think I'm most comfortable with. And the system should be able to convert this, if I want to see it with relation to the note, to something like this, which doesn't have the note, allowing me to easily transpose everything to all 12 collections of 7 notes. So notice, so then if I scroll down, this would be a C major 7 or a major 7, right? I can remove the C, and then you have a major 9, major 11, major 13. Lydian then has, you can call it an F major because that would be the related Lydian, but I'd rather just call it a 3-note Lydian, right? A 4-note Lydian, an F major 9, a major sharp 11, a major 13 sharp 11, remembering that these naming conventions are ugly, whereas these naming conventions are clean. Why are these ugly? Because we're forcing ourselves to use note names and compare it to the major naming convention instead of just saying, this is natural, this is what happens if you build off of the Lydian node. If you build off the Lydian node, just take the intervals from the Lydian node and you don't have to do anything ugly. You just say that's just what happens when you build it off the Lydian node. Just build a 3-note Lydian, a 4-note Lydian, just take every other note, every other modal half step from the Lydian node. And then that will make it not ugly in the naming convention, and it will make it automatically transposable. Same with the Mixolydian. They made up these terms for Mixolydian, G7, G9 instead of G major 7. Again, if you just say, hey, look, it's a 3-note Lydian, a 4-note Lydian, a Mixolydian, a 5-note Mixolydian, then it doesn't get ugly. You don't have to make up things. You just say those are the natural intervals. Just do the natural intervals when you go from the Mixolydian and a normal 7-note chord. And obviously the Aeolian, the Dorian, and then the Phrygian and the Locrian. So I started with the majors first: Ionian, Lydian, Mixolydian, major modes, minor modes, Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian, and then the Locrian. So that gives, so those, all of those can be mapped out: a 3-note chord by modal point, 4-note chord by modal point, and so on and so forth. Now, we are going to end up in a situation, if I want to rotate the chords then, if I write the chord like this, it's a 3-note Ionian, and I want to turn the dial to make it a Dorian, one notch up. That I would actually be down here. So that would be a 3-note Dorian. It automatically will snap into place, meaning the Dorian has a minor third. But if you just write the chord, then you just write the chord, right? And the minor third will snap into place, because all I'm saying is the Ionian is now Dorian, right? So it allows you to rotate through the modal positions as well as to transpose. Now, the only problem with that, however, is that if I'm looking at this over here from the perspective of the Dorian, like let's say I map this out and I write my music by relative position, Nashville number. And if I'm in the Ionian, the 1 would be the lowest pitched number. But if I shift it to the Dorian, right? If I shift it to the Dorian, I can change this. So if I go down and change this to the Dorian, now this chord is now a Dorian. That snaps into place beautifully. The Ionian now changed to a 2, which is fine. So I'm still going to use the same numbering system. I'm not going to say, look, I'm in Dorian and now Dorian is the 1. No, I'm going to keep the Dorian the 2. I'm just going to say the 2 is now the tonic. But if I do that, notice that if I put an Ionian, a 1, these 1s over here, pitch-wise, should be higher in pitch than the Dorian. So I have to basically be able to memorize or be able to think that the 2 is now the tonic. If I take into it, it's got the same Nashville numbers, 1 through 7, plus the 0.5s for those 5 numbers in the ocean, what I call in the ocean or out of the key. But from an octave perspective, if the 2 is the tonic, I need to make it the lowest note, right? And so that means that now the lowest note in this column should be D Dorian if we're playing in the relative Dorian to the C major collection. So that's going to be the idea. How could we do that? Well, one way we could do that is I could then look at my numbering system over here. You'll recall that we had up here, we had C going up in pitch in a DAW system going this way. And then we had our numbers, we can number that 1 through 12. And then we had our MIDI numbers, which start at 60 to 71. This is the permanent numbering system for a MIDI system. What I'd like, this is the relative position, 1 through 7. So 1, 1.5, 2, 2.53, 4, because there's no 0.5 between 3 and 4, 4.55, 5.56, 6.57. We end up with 5.5s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because there's 5 notes out of the collection of notes. They're still available to you, but those aren't the ones that are standard in the collection of notes. So if I can see my formula, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, half step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, whole step to a whole number, and then it would start over again. This is the local distance, which starts back over at 1. But I can make an absolute relative or Nashville number position, meaning it takes into account octaves. So instead of going from 7 back to 1, as if we're going around in a circle or a clock, it goes to 8, and then 8.5 and 9, and so on and so forth. So now I'm taking into account octaves from the relative perspective of a Nashville number system. So that means that if I'm over here looking at my chords, when I go to a Dorian, I'm gonna need to adjust. The Ionian needs to be from an absolute Nashville number system. It needs to be an 8, not a 1. The Ionian needs to be the octave higher when I map it out. So then same thing. So that's what these are all doing. These are mapping out the 1 octave higher as I shift forward through the 7 modes. And so you can take a look at that if you want to get more into the background or detail of that from a coding situation or standpoint. This is going to be my Nashville numbers. Now remember, the Nashville numbers I'm representing them going up now in pitch, as is typically the case in like a DAW type of system. So now we have here if we start on A, let's start on C, like C is over here. So we have 1 to 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but then the 0.5s, same numbering system we looked at before. So whole step to D, whole step to E, half step to F, whole step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, meaning this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the collection of notes around the key of C. The ones that have sharps or flats are in the ocean, right? Those are the 5 notes that are not in the collection of notes, still available, but they're going to be listed as the 0.5 notes to indicate that those are the ones that are going to be outside the collection. So you just want to note that, and that's a nice indication if you're actually writing music in a DAW, particularly for those that don't know music well, right? Because then you can easily have the indication, oh, it's a 0.5 note. It's one that's in the ocean. It's outside the collection. Be careful. Make sure you're adding that intentionally. All right. So then this gives us our 12 collections of notes from this perspective. From the perspective. So if I start on an A, whatever, all 12 collections of notes, giving us those collection of notes from the perspective, not of 1 through 12 as relative positions of the notes, but instead as this Nashville number perspective. That allows me the dial. It allows me to shift this perspective from an absolute perspective, gives me the dial to shift. This is the same thing, but it's just using numbers. Now up top, this is just a reference to the cell references that I used in the formulas if you want to get into the Excel to see how to map this out. So all that information then allows us to map this out into what I would call like the sheet music kind of situation. So even if you're doing it by hand, as we've discussed, I think it would be best to say, look, this middle point right here is like the middle area of the piano where you usually write. But I'm going to list that middle point by telling you what collection of notes we are in and the tonic. That is, to me, the most systematic way to tell people what you're doing, right? You're going to say, I'm in the collection of notes around the C major and the tonic is C. But I could say that I'm in the collection of notes around C major and the tonic is the and the tonic is the mixolydian, the 5. So you could just say, well, why don't I just call that a G mixolydian? You could, but notice that means that you have to find the collection of notes from the perspective of the mixolydian. So it's kind of easier, as with the Nashville numbers typically do in a Nashville number system, to say, this is the collection of notes we're in. Let's do the formula and name the collection of notes from the perspective of the major scale so you can apply the major formula to figure out the notes in the collection and then tell you what the tonic is so that you know what the focal point of the song is. That's the perspective or viewpoint of the song. And then you can write the song, once again, from that middle point, whatever the lowest note is in the 12-note collection. In this middle area, that would be like the middle C, middle D, E, and then you can go then I only have to go up here to the next row up when I go to the next octave up from the lowest point that I'm in, right? And then another octave up. Now, it would be nice in a system that you could have multiple rows here. This is why I have multiple rows, so that you could still stack notes if you wanted to. So you should have some option rows available to us, or possibly be able to add rows so I can still stack even though I'm in this condensed type of format in the same octave, or then go up to the next octave. But that's the idea. Now I could write it this way, or I could write it this way, giving us the actual notes. But either way, I want to then view it from the perspective of not the notes, but the relative position. That allows me to transpose it. So even if I'm writing in the collection of notes around the key of C, I would name that first, name it over here. This is the key of C, collection of notes, and then write it without referring to any notes. Why? Because then you can transpose it. Then all I have to do is change over here. Now I'm looking at the collection of notes around the D, right? D major and everything. I don't need to rewrite anything, right? It's all already there. You just transpose everything shape-wise, which is easy to do on a guitar, and I get on a piano. There's a reason why the tablature developed the way it did, because then you can name the sharps and flats and so on and so forth, which are going to map out differently. But that's only on the piano, and even on the piano, it should be pretty clear that you could just basically shift everything up. The pattern still shifts up. It's just the shape of the keys that are different sizes, which leads you to want to name the number of sharps and flats and all that kind of stuff. But so that's going to be the general idea. Now, once you have this, then of course it should be in a MIDI system available to you to map it out. Now, this is using the numbering systems for MIDI, so that allows us to map it out, and this is just using the letters. So now we're just going to say this is the lowest C, and it's mapping out here. Now, if I changed the tonic, then all that would happen is that if I changed that tonic to a 6 to the D, but it's still D major, then this whole pattern would shift up to here, is one way that you can think of it, right? This whole thing would shift up to here. This orange bit right here would be the lowest note, and this orange bit over here would be the D now. And when it shifts over here, the whole thing would be shifting up from this perspective, have the same exact shape, because it would still be D Ionian. It would still be D Ionian, right? So this would shift up to here. Everything would be the same D Ionian. Okay, so but the little bit more complex thing is to shift from the Ionian around the modal perspectives to like the Dorian or something like that. Notice that if I'm looking at it this way, you might say, well, I shouldn't have to do anything, because if I write the song from relative position, these are the Nashville numbers. So if I transpose this to think about it in Dorian, well, the 2 is the Dorian. So all I would have to do is, if the song was written so that it emphasizes or it leads back to the 2, then the 2 would be the tonic, and it would be in Dorian. You'd have the same collection of 7 notes, but the song would be in Dorian, which is true. So that's one way that you can kind of think of it, that you're basically looking at the 2 in Dorian. But if you take octaves into consideration, this middle row, if I say this Dorian is the tonic, I would like the Dorian to basically be the lowest note. So if I tell the system, look, the Dorian is the tonic, and I wrote the same thing, then you would think that this 1 would be higher up in pitch than the 2. Whereas if I told it that I'm writing this in Ionian, then I would think that the 1 right here would be lower in pitch than the 2 over here. That's one thing that to consider. And then if I was to, the other thing that would be nice is that if I want to rotate the song or part of the song from Ionian to Dorian, this whole thing should be shifting forward. So there's 2 things that we can write here. One is the chord, which is actually easier to shift forward, because I can just change it from the Ionian node 1 step up to the Dorian node, and then it'll map on the fact that it has a minor third as opposed to a major third. So the whole thing will rotate around, snapping into place for the chord that will fit. Meaning, if I wrote a chord that is in the collection of notes, I should land on a chord that uses all the notes that are in the collection of notes, and it should make the Dorian, the root note, the lowest note. Whereas if I wrote a relative modal perspective or just a singular note, then if it's a whole note, I should rotate it. Meaning, if it's a 1, it's going to rotate to a 2. That would mean it's an Ionian. It's going to rotate to a Dorian. If it's a Dorian, it's going to rotate to a Phrygian. If it's a 3, Phrygian. I'm sorry. If it's a 3 Phrygian, it's going to rotate to a Lydian. Now, if it's a 2.5, that would rotate to a 4.5. There is a 3.5. There is no 3.5. That's where the snapping comes into play, right? You have to say, if you rotate it up 1 and you have something that's in the ocean or not in the collection of notes, if I rotate it up 1 number, then, and it's still not in the collection of notes, fine. But it's possible that if I rotate it up, I'm going to land in the middle here. There is nothing there, so it's going to snap into a number that is in the collection of notes. So that's going to be the only thing that's a little bit wonky, but it's totally doable from a formula standpoint, and then I can rotate this forward. So if I played it in the Ionian, then I should be able to shift everything to the Dorian. So now this whole thing has been shifted up. The numbers have shifted up. The one other thing that's a little wonky is that if something was a 7, it would get shifted up to an 8. But the 8 is over the 7-note collection, so it would come back down to a 1. But remember that 1 is lower, is higher in pitch than the 2 now, because the 2 is the Dorian. Now again, this might all sound a little bit like that's way too complicated, and so on and so forth, if you've learned piano music theory your entire life. But I would guarantee you that if you're looking at most people that are using a DAW that haven't learned piano theory their entire life, this is easier than learning the piano theory. The piano actually leads a lot of things in. It forces you into this thinking of sharps and flats, which you normally wouldn't do. And it forces you into making the C major like some kind of holy grail like key where it's not in reality, right? So most people if they're not using a keyboard in their DAW system, you shouldn't be giving them a piano keyboard to learn to play on a DAW unless they want to learn the piano, right? Because on a DAW, like this would be way easier to learn. You're just like, hey, look, you want to play a song, you just play the notes on a 10 key like a typewriter, 1 through 7, and then you have 5 notes in the ocean, right? So most people are basically just adding the notes 1 through 7 from a Nashville number perspective, and then you just say, hey, look, you want to make whatever each of those notes, one of them needs to be the tonic, right? So if you make the 2 the tonic, just remember that's going to be the lowest note in the progressions of notes. All the other notes are going to be higher in each row. Those rules are way easier to be able to play in multiple keys and multiple modes than to learn that the piano C is the master key and so on. So I just want to point that out because I'm sure there'll be a lot of, that's not standard. I get it. It's not standard. The standard is whack. It's like, okay, but anyway, so see how this got shifted up to the D. Now this got shifted up to the D, but it's not going to be exactly the same shift up because now it's D Dorian. So notice what happened over here is the numbers have changed over here because if you think about this as a dial, notice what happened. This shifted up from an absolute note perspective. But we have a different shift on this dial, which is the absolute relative position perspective, because this didn't shift up to an Ionian. It shifted up to a D Dorian. So that means it's starting on the 2 now. This is starting on the 2, whereas up here this C was starting on the 1. So you can see what the dials are, right? You've got these 3 things that are kind of mapped up against each other. That's what you get. That's what you're allowed to have by mapping out the relative position. So then from an absolute note perspective, we just moved up from C or 60 up to D. But then from a relative Nashville number perspective, this dial didn't shift up the same way because we didn't shift this up to the 1 right here. We kept it at 2. And so now you're mapping out the Nashville number system from the 2. So that allows you to rotate it around. And then if I rotated it from the Dorian, snap it up another nod to the Phrygian. So now I'm going to move it up here. Now, as I go to the Phrygian, note what I'm not going to do is if you're going to map this out on a DAW system or in a database, you don't want to go from the Ionian to the Dorian and then the Dorian to the Phrygian. You want to go from whatever you started writing the music in and then map each of the 7 modes to that perspective. Why? Because the Dorian has already been distorted, right? Meaning the Dorian snapped into place and these 2 4s are different than what we started with. So what I want to do is say, if I wrote it in Ionian, I want to go back to Ionian and turn the dial up 2. So meaning this 1 will be going up 2 dials up to 3. This 2 will be 3, 4, 5. But then this 1.5 is the problem because the 1.5 will be 2, 3.5. which lands you in an area that doesn't exist. So it would have to snap up to 4. Whereas you'd end up with a different set of problems if you did this. It'll distort the music more than it needs to be. So as I rotate through the dial, I'm not building the next node on the prior set of information. I'm building it from the root. Each of them are building up from the root. So this is going 2 up. This Phrygian is moving 2 up on the dial from the original key the song was in, the Ionian. Now note that I built this out from the perspective of writing a song in the Ionian. But if you're in a database system, you should be able to say, I'm going to write the song in whatever key I want, whatever collection of notes I want, and even possibly writing multiple parts of the song in different collection of notes and from a different modal perspective, right? And then it should be able to the database program should be able to map out shifting the entire song from that perspective, whatever you started from, or each individual piece of that song should be able to be rotatable and so on. But anyways, it moves it up from a 1 to a 3, and then the 2.5 got shifted to 4 because there is no 3.5, and then the 4, and then the 4. And then if I go over here, we could say what got mapped out on this side. Now from the dials on the left, what happened? Well, we were on the C, and we're on this C, and we shifted it up to the E. But we didn't shift up the relative positions from a modal standpoint the same. This dial didn't shift up exactly the same because I didn't make this the 1. This is now the 3 because we're starting on the third, the relative third, which is the E. And so therefore the pattern that I see going up is not going to be the exact same pattern as we saw from the perspective of the Ionian. All right, and then we go back, and so then if I go back here again, we can say, okay, so then if I go to, what did I just do? The Phrygian, the Lydian, same thing. We shifted up from the Ionian to the Lydian. So now we've gone up to the Lydian, and we map that out over here. Boom. And so now if I map that out, now we went from the C up to an F. But this dial is now not at the 1, we're starting at 4. 1 is going to be down here at the C because we're shifting up. And then we go from the Lydian to the Mixolydian. So once again, I'm pulling from the original thing. The song was written in Ionian. I shift the dial up 4, which means it goes from Ionian to the Mixolydian. Meaning if it was a 1, this was a 1, it got shifted up 4 dials to get to 5. 1 plus 4 is 5. And then this got mapped out. So if I go over here, we say, okay, now this, from the DAW perspective, this dial got shifted up from an absolute note perspective to here, but all the relative positions are not the same because I shifted this dial over here to have that G not be relative position 1 from a Nashville number system, but relative position 5 from a Nashville number system. So it's going to be mapped out from the perspective then of the Mixolydian. And then if we go to this one, Aeolian, so now I started with the Aeolian Ionian, and I shifted it up 6 knobs to get to the Aeolian, or meaning I was on the Ionian and I shifted it up 5 knobs to get to the 6, which is Nashville number 6, which is the Aeolian. Now remember, if I'm on the Aeolian, I still have the same numbers 1 through 7 plus the ones in the ocean, but the 6 in this center point should be the lowest note. If it's A, then the 6 is represented in A. The A should be lower, right, than the Ionian. The Ionian is a C. The A should be lower in pitch than the C. Whereas if I was playing an Ionian, this 1 would be lower in pitch than the 6. That's all you need to know if you're writing your song. If I'm playing in the around the 6th note, which would be the Aeolian, I just need to know it's just going to be 1 through 7 still, plus the ones in the ocean, but the 6 is going to be the lowest one in pitch for each of these rows that we're going to be playing in, allowing me to see everything much more cleanly in one location. So I can see if something's going up or down by the numbers, because there's only 1 through 7 plus the notes that are in the ocean, right? And then if I go over here, I can say, how do we map this out here? Well, this dial, we shifted it up to A, but this dial, we didn't shift this dial up to A. This dial is at a 6 because it's the related 6. Therefore, the shape going up is going to be changed from the perspective of the Aeolian relative positions as opposed to the Ionian. And then finally, the Locrian. Most people wouldn't shift it to the Locrian, but you could. Idea being the same. You go from, you're on the Ionian, you shift it up 6 to get to the 7th node, which is the Locrian. This was a 1, now it's a 7, for example, and the idea is the same. So we have here then that we shifted up to the B, from the C to the B, but this dial didn't shift exactly the same because we're looking at the relative position of 7. So when we map out the distance from there, it's from the distance of the Locrian intervals, not the Ionian intervals or any of the others. So hopefully, so this is how I think normal music, like people just writing their music down, would write it most easily. If you didn't have all the baggage, this is how you would write it down, I think, most easily for most people. And you can get more complicated, like I say, by assigning each part of your music, like a jazz player might do, to each modal perspective that you're looking at that part of music from, and possibly each collection of notes you're looking at that part from. And then you should be able to, like a Rubik's Cube, take the two dials of relative position and shift what you've played, either the whole tune or the pieces of the tune, to all 12 collections of relative modal perspectives, Ionian, Dorian, whatever, through all 12 collections of notes, or change the dial to all modal perspectives. Rotate the modal perspective that you're looking from. That to me is just, that seems just clear that that's what the DAW systems should have the capacity to do, and clear that that seems like the most efficient way for most people to jot down their musical ideas.